meeting is being recorded.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, members of the Cybersecurity Collaborative and guests. We're so delighted to have you here today to present a CISO's Guide to Effective Risk Assessments, a virtual briefing that we have at the conclusion of every task force meeting. I'm Tom Skura. I'm the Vice President of Content and Programs at the Cybersecurity Collaborative. We have some great panelists here today, whom I will introduce shortly, but I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. There will be questions you have. There's no open mic, but you can put your questions in the question box. We do encourage these. We will get to them as many as we can at the end. Sometimes during the session, we'll be able to also answer them as well. There's a lot of material we're covering today. We don't want anyone to get dizzy over looking at all these slides. So the copy of this presentation is available to all CSC members. It will be in the member portal, plus all the content that comes out of this. For our guests, you can request a copy of the presentation. We'll provide information at the end of this session to allow you to make that request. And again, try to listen to some of the main points of the panelists out of this. And again, you can take the presentation to get into detail later on. I also remind you, this is equivalent to 1 CPE for those who have security certifications. So again, we can validate that too as well at the end. So I'd first like to just have each of my panelists tell the audience a little about his or her experience or company and just provide some general information. I'll start with Michelle Amonte, the cybersecurity analyst at DuPage County, Illinois. Michelle has been a very active participant in the collaborative and in our task forces. So Michelle, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Great, thank you so much, Tom. As you said, my name is Michelle Amonte, and I'm the cybersecurity analyst with DuPage County, Illinois. I've been with the county for almost 11 years. I've been doing security for around 5 years, just as a partial and then full-time for 2 years.
Thank you, and glad to have you here. And Lou Klumenspies, CISO of Perkin-Elmer, always glad to have you, a very active member on this team. And please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thanks, Tom. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lou Klumenspies. I'm the CISO at Perkin-Elmer. I have been with the company now for about 6 years. Prior to that, was in the federal and DoD consulting space with Booz Allen Hamilton. Been in cyber for over a decade, and this is my 38th year in IT. Feels like it's been a minute. Glad to be part of the panel.
38 years ago, ChatGPT never existed, right? That's another discussion.
A lot of things didn't exist.
I know, I was back there then too. Thank you, Lou, for being here. Rich Nagel, CISO of Ohio State University, very active participants in our collaborative. Rich, as always, glad to have you here. You've been a great participant on a number of these panels.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So Rich Nagel from Ohio State, smaller university located in Columbus, Ohio. We've got about 70,000 students, 15 colleges, 40,000 employees. I've been here at the university for just about 8 years. I've been in the CISO role for about 2 years here. Prior to that, was at JPMorgan Chase for about 13 years, various places in and around before that. Been in security for about close to 17 years, I guess, maybe now. So been a long time, and like Lou, been around IT in general for a very, very long time, and not sure I can spell ChatGPT. I'd like not to be able to spell it right now. Certainly top of mind for a lot of folks. So,
thank you, Rich, as always. And Richard Rushing, who is Motorola Mobility, a great contributor to all our events. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, as always. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Rushing. I'm CISO for Motorola Mobility Company. I've been CISO there now going on 16 years. So I've been in security pretty much all my life, which I won't, this platinum blonde hair that I'm sporting now, it dates me a little bit on that side, but it's many decades, and I'm not going past what many actually means just to make me feel old on that side of it that's there. But I've worked for large organizations globally, for like Siemens, as well as GE. I've also founded several startups in the past, so I've sat on both sides of the table from folks on that side of it, and I'm fairly active in the cybersecurity community, kind of the same way as the collaborative is about giving back.
And you certainly have given a lot back here. That's the one thing about the collaborative is we all give and learn from each other. And it's our experiences as professionals across multiple industries that enrich our own ability to move our cybersecurity programs forward. So thank you all, panelists. We could all write a history book, I think, by the time we're done. When I started eons ago, there was no such thing as cybersecurity history. It was all one program. Now we have many programs under one umbrella. So for those who aren't familiar with the Cybersecurity Collaborative, I hope you got the message that that we all work together and collaborate. So one might ask, well, what's the benefit for CISOs and what's the benefit for CISO staff? Because those are two broad areas that we support. For CISOs, every morning you get a morning security report on all major events, threats, vulnerabilities. You will not walk in blindsided and someone asks, what happened about that log porch thing and what are we doing about it, and not being aware of it. It's an excellent report. It comes out at 6:30 Eastern in the morning. There are peer-to-peer connections. There's Ask the Expert Rapid Response. CISO boardrooms, and also task forces that we put together, and this being one of them. We take broad security topics, we spend 8 weeks on them, and from that we share our best practices, and then we produce tools and guidance documents for our members. For the staff, I have to remind members on here that this is a great resource for staff. One of the obvious ways is to gain CPE credits by participating on the task forces, but we have over 100 webinars already that you have access to. That's 100 potential CPEs right there. We offer a cybersecurity leadership program to your staff as well. It really teaches them the principles of leadership, preparing them for more advanced roles in the cybersecurity field. We have a number of engagements that people can attend. Sessions, offsite sessions as well that we offer. Also for the staff, if you have staff working on particular areas like developing a security metrics program or enhancing a vulnerability management program, we have task forces. It allows your staff to go in there and learn from other peers and collaborate, not only in the task forces, but outside of the task forces as well. So this collaboration, we have Slack channels, is a way to really gain the benefit of the experience of other people in this business, not just from analysts from the outside, from members doing it. And that's what we do. We're an organization that gives. We're vendor independent. We do talk about vendors, but we don't promote any vendor idea or have any financial ties to vendors in this organization. So now let's move on to the subjects. We'll talk about the background of the task force. There are 7 challenges we want to talk about. Risk assessments are a foundation of every cybersecurity program, but there's 7 challenges that we will again talk about, and then as we get into the discussion, you'll learn how we collectively have started to manage those challenges, and we'll provide guidance for doing that. We've developed a cybersecurity collaborative risk assessment security model, and this is what happens in a task force. We have Richard coming in and say, well, there could be the best thing you could do, but the fact of the matter is not everyone can get to the best right away. So why don't we look at a good, better, best approach to this? In other words, how do we get to the good, then how do we improve, and then how do we get advanced? And I think that was a good way to look at this, because rather than looking at a risk assessment methodology that's very complex and costly, not everyone can afford it. So we've actually developed that model and are providing advice around that. And we'll talk about the guidance for maturing framework tiers and components. We'll then talk about the support tools that were provided and developed out of this particular team. These are for our members. And then at the end, we'll talk about the task forces and key content additions of the collaborative and other 2023 initiatives. And we'll close with a Q&A. So we have weekly meetings. There are about 8 or 10 meetings that we have an hour each. We structure these meetings. We just don't talk about the same thing every meeting. We may talk about risk assessment methodologies. How do you improve risk treatment decisions and acceptance of risks? What types of tools are used? We structure these meetings. We have organizations representing different industries and government agencies. Everyone says, well, why not just make it industry specific? And there are some advantages to that, but I'm learning in other task forces that there are industries where regulations have made them more advanced in areas, and the benefits of those advancements can be applied to smaller groups and organizations. So definitely, collaboration among different companies and different industries has its benefit. As you can see here, we've have a good cross section of organizations that help us prepare all the materials that came out of this and added to the discussions. Members share the successes, false starts, and challenges. We're all under NDAs. We've not all had successes. We've failed, but in this profession, as we were just talking beforehand, you fall down and you get up and you go forward. You have no choice. And there's a lot of value from the collaboration as much as from deliverables. Let me just ask my panelists, any insights or thoughts that you have that you got out of these team meetings in terms of benefits to you, benefits of collaboration? Just any thoughts you care to share now? I appreciate hearing them.
Sure, Tom. From my perspective, I think the biggest value that I get from this is the opportunity to speak to other practitioners. I think that's the most valuable thing for me, right? Is being able to bring a set of assumptions or experiences to the team and get that either validated or refuted. I actually don't care which it is, as long as it's one or the other. And basically be able to speak to other folks that are living the same life and have to deal with the same challenges. So for me, that's the big value add of the collaborative.
Right, and those engagements can and continue on well beyond the task forces. We have the tools and vehicles for you to kind of continue doing that and make those continued professional relationships sustain. Anyone else quickly?
Definitely what Lou said. It's very helpful to just get different opinions and see other viewpoints.
Yeah, I'll echo too what Lou said. I think the biggest value for us is validating what we're doing, right? We all think we're doing something and we're doing it right. And this is validation that either it is, or there may be room for improvement in other areas or learnings from other spaces that we could incorporate into our own processes. So valuable there.
I think it's one of the key areas that you often run into is that it is a crowdsourced model. We're taking a group of people that have very diverse industries, backgrounds, and everything else, and what works in their organization, putting it all together and saying, hey, this is there. And there's learnings from each of those. Even though I'm not in some of these industries like education and everything else, some of the ways that they are doing things enlightened to the other way of supply chain and things around that. So you learn something all the time. And I think that is the nature of this. You bring people together that want to collaborate, you end up with the outcome is a much better solution than you can ever come up, even using something like ChatGPT to give you an answer on what a risk assessment best practices would be. I think we did better.
I think the fact that you're talking and engaging, as you said, and not just separately in isolation reading a document and advice makes all the difference in the world. And you're allowed then to kind of follow up. We have the opportunities to follow up for more detailed discussions, which is the benefit of collaboration. Well, thank you all for sharing that. I'm going to go through the 7 challenges relatively quickly, and then I'll pause at the end of these and just ask for panelists to kind of corroborate some of these things, or maybe offer some guidance on these, although we're going to be getting into some guidance, but just to hear from the panelists. So the first thing is sort of the obvious thing, that risk assessments are required. Maybe we haven't really understood how much they are required. HIPAA, ISO requires that you're not required to implement all the controls in XA, but you are required to do an annual risk assessment. PCI version 4.0, that's a subject for another day, but they've always required an annual risk assessment in the PCI environment. 4.0 is very, very complex. I haven't figured it out yet, but still required. SOC 2 types 1 and 2, typically you're required to have it as a control and then follow through and have it validated. And there are a number of state laws that are doing this. So it is the foundation of the security program as far as risks go, but it is a requirement. So we're stuck doing it. If we're stuck doing it, let's make it as effective as possible. The second challenge is there are a lot of moving parts. Okay, I'm not going to read through this again. You're all going to get a copy of this, and you've seen this, but because there are a lot of moving parts that constitute this, it makes it difficult to kind of explain risk oftentimes to executives, and we'll talk about that. The third thing is there are many use cases. Enterprise is the one we talk a lot, but there are members on the team that are looking at various technology environments, cloud infrastructure, application, and third party, which often become control assessments, but in some of our members are actually tying them more to risks and make them a part of the risk assessment fabric. So the annual enterprise one is typically required, but others use the same approaches of likelihood and impact and scoring in other environments as well. The fourth issue is that there are many methodologies you can choose from. Okay, there's ISO, NIST, FAIR, which is, and they're qualitative and quantitative in nature. FAIR being quantitative. We'll talk a little bit about that. At the risk of using a term in the COVID days, security risk is not highly communicable. So not to turn that around from a medical term, here's an example of what you probably want to say when you're talking about a risk if you're really true to all the components. Here is our number one risk. There is a high likelihood that cyber criminals will exploit the ignorance of our employees who are improperly trained through phishing emails where attached ransomware is downloaded, allowing the cyber criminal to infiltrate our network so that personal information may be found and exfiltrated, resulting in a data breach with great financial impact to our firm in the form of privacy-related fines and lawsuits. And of course, some will say, oh, you mean a ransomware risk? And no, ransomware is a method and only one component of a risk. Shall I recite our 9 other risks? So the challenge is the security risk assessment has all these components and they're expected to be dealt with properly when you're doing it. When you communicate it, however, it's a different challenge. The last is, no, the sixth is complexity may drive stakeholders away. Stakeholders are going to provide input. So here's an example. Our risk assessment spreadsheet is all done. We just need your help with data entry. And someone's saying, is he serious about having me determine and justify the likelihood and impact value of over 1,500 risks? Some of these things can be very complex, and asking stakeholders to provide input on that can be very time consuming and challenging. And the last is the outcomes of risk assessments may make risk mitigation decisions very difficult. On what basis can we accept risk? And that's easy. Anything with a risk score under 23,655, we can accept. Anything above, we must mitigate. So there's always a challenge in the complexity of these things to be able to allow decision makers to either accept or treat a risk. So let me just stop with the 7 challenges here. Panelists, any thought on any of these that you've come across in your experience and how you've had to deal with these?
I think from the perspective of the communicable side of it is extremely important because, and we've talked about this for years at the CISO level, is speaking the language of the business. The problem is we speak a lot of the language of the business, but a lot of the programs and technologies and everything else don't translate very well. We're missing some much needed vocabulary or a Rosetta Stone so that they can understand what we're talking about and vice versa and how it affects them. And I think that's probably one of the bigger things is as you start doing it, there's different ways to approach the problem with the information, not just PowerPoint, not just a chart, not just a heat map, different ways to communicate that on those sides of it. And I think that's some of the stuff of being qualitative versus quantitative areas and things around that is the business wants one thing, we're wanting to deliver something else, and it might be what we think they want, but they are saying, no, it's not. And then that's where things kind of, I wouldn't say go bad. It's just, I can't get my point across. I can't get them to understand this, or they will accept any risk, no matter what it is. And I think those are some of the key caveats that are, how do you handle those? How do you deal with those kind of things? What's some avenues that are there? And I think those are some of the things that are definitely part of the heavy challenges and the hardest to actually solve.
I mean, that puts a lot of onus on the CISO, as you said, to translate, right? To be able to look at a risk assessment from the detail perspective, but then communicate that to management whose time is constrained and really wants to get right to the point, right? So you really have to develop skills in that area. Is that correct?
That's correct. And again, it's part of things. You always heard the term, keep it simple, stupid, kind of stuff. It's the same thing of how do you think we come up with a good, better, best? Trying to convince three different areas, which one do you want is cumbersome because yeah, it's going to get confusing. No one, the law department doesn't come up. Do you want us to lose the case, win the case, or not go to trial? Those are not three avenues that they proceed to go, what do you want us to do? And I think those are the same thing. This is kind of yeah, you need to do something. Which one do you have that? Because one may impact productivity and users, our partners. Some may impact the people. Some may impact how you do business. And you want to figure out what those things are, and providing a choice between those solutions show that you thought about the business and you're mindful of expenditures, you're mindful of people, you're mindful of other resources. And I think that's comes across as a mature area just by giving them a choice.
Excellent. Good idea. One last thing, and anyone else wants to chime in, that's great too. Do you think quantitative risk assessments typically are harder to do and take more time? We know that. We talked about the FAIR model and so forth, which has a lot of value. Do you think if you had your druthers, if you could come up with quantitative results, which are loss expectancies in dollar terms, that the decision-making process to treat or accept risk would be easier for management to make and easier for you to communicate to management? Or is that not necessarily the case?
I'll jump in here. I think maybe, and I know that's kind of a horrible answer, but I think back to the conversation we're having right now is you need to understand the business and what is, so this very simple question that's being asked on this slide, which is on what basis can we accept a risk? The answer is easy. It's under X. But to get to that answer, you need to understand what that risk appetite is that the business has. And it's different in every business. And even within industries, it's different. So I think getting to that is a quantitative way will certainly help some, right? It would be very easy for some to say, if it's X, then Y, then great, right? And make that decision. It's all laid out. In other terms, it's not going to be that simple. And you really need to understand what that risk appetite is to be able to present that back in a business language. Maybe it is quantitative, maybe it's not, that they're going to understand and be able and comfortable with making that decision.
I think that's a good point. I think you can use qualitative risk scores and we'll talk about it, if you kind of bucket the risks, but come back to describe it and making sure that they understand it rather than setting a numerical value as this bad example shows. You know, I think you have to engage in that discussion, or you know, I can't accept every risk, but the top third I can do, and they'll make a decision on that basis. The quantitative sounds very appealing, and it is. It also takes a bit more work to make happen. And in the good, better, best model, it's probably more toward the best side. It may not be something the companies have right away. So thank you. I'm going to proceed to the next series of slides relatively quickly. Again, I remind everyone you're going to have a copy of this presentation if you're a member, and if you're not, you can request it. So you'll get a little more of the detail. But one of the things that we do, and this is again through the inspiration of one of our panelists here, is to chunk this into some reasonable way to kind of look at the whole risk assessments fabric. Okay, and so we've come up with a risk assessments maturity model, and it consists of 3 tiers. There's a support foundation. And it isn't just the methodology, but you've got to have management acceptance, and need and value, stakeholder participation, and administrative resources to do this. And it takes time to develop that. But at the base of this, if it's not there, all your other components are going to be less effective. Methodology and tools, a risk definition, a register, industry accepted methodology, this ISO, something like that. A documented process that's required for ISO, but it is good to have a standard of some kind that talks about how you're calculating risk and what tools you're using. And then support tools. Typically spreadsheets are used, but some members use GRC tools to help collect information, SharePoint, et cetera. And the last is, out of all of this, there has to be some decision and mitigation processes in place. A decision to accept or treat the risk, and then mitigation activities that are followed on. If that doesn't happen, all the other aspects don't mean anything. But again, to get to that point, you really have to have a good support foundation and methodology and tools to do this. So in short, the effectiveness of the upper tier depends on the maturity of the components of the lower tiers. And what we've done is taken this model and essentially in our guidance document, which is available for members, we've taken each of these components and we've broken it down into a not-in-place, basic, advanced, exceptional, good, better, best model describing your maturity in these areas. And then we provided detailed guidance, general guidance, and if you're not in place, how to get to basic to advanced. And actually, we do have a checklist that you can follow in the guidance document for members to actually help improve various aspects of your program. So you really have to, you know, if they're not making risk acceptance decisions or not participating, maybe they don't understand the value, or you don't have stakeholder participation. These are all important things to look at. And this is the guidance document that we put together that is followed on the model, which is coming out next week for members. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. The support foundation, management acceptance, stakeholder participation, and administrative resources. Here's a quick example of where your maturity level is. General guidance, you need to convince management of the need for risk assessments. You can start with the fact that you have compliance obligations. Maybe that's already known, but they need to understand their role in that and stakeholder participation. Use standing meetings to make the case for risk assessments. You know, an executive steering committee, you know, bring that up as you know, not, without creating a separate meeting if you don't need to. If resources are available, leverage the skills of a credible third party to administer assessment, engage management in risk acceptance, risk treatment decisions. So if you're new at this, again, there's a cost to this. It is often worth having a third party come in and set the program up for you and deal with management. So that will help move things along. But those are key to get the support foundation components in place. The next is you know, methodology and tools, risk definition and register, industry accepted methodology, documented process, and support tools. General guidance is use an industry accepted standard, as we mentioned before. Quantitative risk assessments like FAIR are very effective, but can be difficult to administer without outside expertise. There's a lot of outside support and guidance you can get on this, so you shouldn't be afraid to do that. You may not want to start with a FAIR assessment of the entire enterprise. You may want to start with a qualitative one and move toward that. So test it on a smaller environment. Risk assessment tools, there are a lot of them offered for free and a good place to start. We have them as references in our guidance document. So you don't need to build it. We've actually created one for you. There's some offered by universities and they work really, really, really well. Let me just kind of talk about risk definition and risk register, because everyone talks about this. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that risk really represents loss scenarios. Insiders, reputation, phishing, ransomware, weak passwords are not risks, but I want to talk about the use of those. So the example that we mentioned really has to be shortened to even consider discussing it with management. And as Rich said, that's where the CISO comes in. So we say a risk assessment register can capture all the detail. A corporate risk register can actually summarize and guide the risk assessments rather than having one gigantic risk register. And the CISO can abbreviate the risk definition for management and the board. So the corporate risk register, look at it this way. And again, some people have very sophisticated things that work, so I'm not asking you to change them. It's the what. The risk name, what is the compromise of what is the asset that we're concerned about? You might want to show maximum loss value, which you could do using some insurance data to do that, and the type of breach. Leave it at a high level. And then the risk register, the how, you might say, well, there are many ways to compromise the confidentiality of customer records. There's ransomware, is one means, through phishing or there's the insider threat. The CISO's role is really as the Rosetta Stone. Sorry for that, but I think, as Rich said, it really is true. It's an effort of the CISO to be able to allow the risk assessments to occur at the detail level, but bring the discussion up to the board. And the board is interested in the assets, the value of the assets, and potential compromise. So it's perfectly fine to say, as a risk name, a ransomware compromise of the confidentiality of customer records, as opposed to this long litany on the left, to discuss it with the board. But it is not appropriate to not include all the elements in your risk assessment process. I think that's kind of a good way to kind of structure this in a way that's usable. Qualitative risk assessments, subjective analysis using high, medium, low. This is FAIR Institute. There was an actual on this 830 recommendation on doing this that they took issue with, and makes good sense. You've got to be very careful when you're using ordinal values in describing risk itself. A better way to do it might be calculating risk points. So use a likelihood score of 1 to 10, an impact score of 1 to 10, adjust it by your control strength against vulnerabilities, where 0 is no control and 9 is highly effective. And then multiply likelihood times the impact less the control strength, which is your residual risk. And then prioritize them into high, medium, low categories. Maybe you do a third and a third and a third. Then you can discuss more appropriately the acceptance process. The FAIR methodology, I won't get into it, but it is loss exposure over probability distribution, and does get more into again the costs around that. As far as the last level decision and mitigation processes, risk acceptance criteria and risk reduction activities. Representing risk as potential financial losses is an effective way to help management make those decisions when you can do it. Secondarily, bucking them into the critical high, medium, and low categories will facilitate making those decisions. So you can start with the high ones, and then you can guide saying these are the ones we have the resources for, and at least work on the high areas and refresh it, which means you're improving your program. Risk treatment plans must have an assigned owner or owners, risk treatment activities, a plan and due dates. We talked about POAMs, or however you do it. If you have an information security risk plan, you can put it in that, and they must be monitored. And this is a little detailed chart, but this is an actual example of a company using it. What they did is they looked at the risk. They had a risk score. They did set a number on this one and said, okay, but they discussed it. Okay, yet we know that employee mistakes are our biggest risk here, and targeted malware is. And then they grouped their treatment into different strategy components like data handling, business process improvements, authentication controls, configuration management, et cetera. So, and that informed the decision discussion. So, so again, it's important, again, that you do this, you elevate it to management, and you make the decisions. Any comments from panelists on getting management to make those decisions? Have you found any ways in your experience that have facilitated the decisions to accept or treat risks?
Executive bookmarks always do wonders. No, just kidding. No, I think it's back to the same thing. These are business leaders that are in your organization. They understand business. They understand their organization that's there. So they're trying to, how is this going to impact me is always one of the sides. Is it, oh, my revenue is going to go down, my costs are going to go up, I need to have more people. So you can't come in and say there is no impact, because they will come back and say, well, if there's no impact, why isn't it not done yet? And so there's an impact. So and there's costs that are associated with it. So it's a balancing exercise. But I have to say that as the years have grown on, your best counterpart is like the Wall Street Journal and Fortune and the articles that come out of someone getting breached. They are very in touch with the cybersecurity from the media perspectives on that. So that is also a good point to be well aware of what's going on, of like, we impacted by, we've seen this Log4j, solar winds, you know, the litany of things that were there. They're aware of that. And if you can tie it off or help it or get something that's part of that reduction on that, you're in a winning portion of that. You don't have to discuss it. It's like, if something comes out, you can go, oh, we already did a risk of third-party software in our supply chain, and it's slightly dated, but it's good enough that we can tell you exactly how we're going to solve and fix this issue immediately on that side of it that's there. It may not be accurate to tell you, hey, we got 1,812 systems that are affected by it. That's what we had 3.5 months ago. It may have changed since then, but we've already got the start done, instead of we're starting from ground zero and we have to build all this. And I think that's where you get into some of those, is the understanding that it's a series of levers and switches that you've got to dial into what is important. And it is different from the CFO. It is different from the CIO. It's different from the CEO, director of marketing. Each one has their own little things that you're going to have to adjust when you're talking to those individuals or working with them or trying to convince them that they need to address these kind of risks.
Richard, I think you really hit on a good point. If you bring in, as you said, the Wall Street Journal, the Morning Security Report, which is our publication, I got to plug that, or any sort of threat intelligence and breach information that has happened out there, that highlights the risk, the need to address it for our organization, because board members are very much concerned in their responsibilities that we don't suffer the way others have. And so that actually brings that into the discussion. So maybe as you're looking at your risks, you relate it to what's happened in the industry and the outside and what we're seeing, and bring that into the discussion. I think that's a very, very good point. So it isn't just the mechanical exercises of organizing these things into a list. It's informing the key areas on the top as it relates to what's really happening in history and the potential to affect ourselves. That's key to the board. Again, it's the CISO that has to bring that level of discussion in. This is not a rote exercise. When you're doing these things, it often seems that way, and that's not what it's about.
Yeah. One other comment real briefly that said consistent messaging is key when you're talking to these executives. Things need to look the same, feel the same, and the same kind of messaging that's going through that. If you're using something to show a quantification of risk, you got to use the same thing for all of it. You just can't use it for this one thing because it will create confusion. Although, where's my bubble chart, or where is this chart that we saw before? Because I understood that one. This one I don't understand. So you really have to, when something works, be consistent with it. That's around that. But you'll fail. I'll be perfectly honest. I've failed multiple times on, oh, this was a brilliant idea, and no, it's going in the trash can after that meeting. And so you've just got to go back. Same issue, just you got to change the messaging and understand what you actually are trying to do. It's not that they were ignoring or didn't want to take it or took exception on it. They didn't understand your messaging. So revise again and go back on that side of it that's there. But like I said, when something's working, be consistent with that, because that's what they're looking for, is the consistency on that. If you're tracking to KPIs or anything, you always got to talk about it, because if the second you don't, people are going to bring that of why is not that. It is, like I said, they're all about consistency in their messaging with all their meetings and that, and you gotta be the same way. And unfortunately, the world we live in is anything but consistent. It is kind of chaos. So there's another piece that you've got to bring the calm to the storm.
I think you made another point, and you got to find out what works with them. And you may have an idea of what works. You may find out it doesn't. That doesn't mean you get up and you come back, right? You keep fighting, as we know as CISOs. And so you have to get feedback and say what didn't work, and then you adjust your messaging. I think that's very important. So we're running close on time. I just want to briefly go over the support tools that are available to members. And for those who will join us, out of these task forces, we usually produce a guidance document, but we do get tools that are provided by members. And we got a nice little tool for one member that it's a basic document that says, what is a risk assessment, for those that don't know anything about it, who may not be in the security organization or IT organizations. The very useful document to say what is a security risk assessment versus some other risk assessment. Talks about what it is and not. It defines risk, shows some examples of risk statements, and shows how risk is measured. Only 2 or 3 pages, but it's a good read. Again, if you as a CISO or a risk security professional are trying to engage stakeholders and management in this process, this is a good place to start. We also have produced an ISO 2701-2022 ISMS Risk Assessment, Risk Treatment Standard. A lot of organizations are moving toward that. You are required to have a standard or process in place that follows that model. You may calculate things a little differently and want to adjust this accordingly, but you already have a good template in place. And we didn't get it from GPT. Support tools, we actually have a little risk assessment workbook that has all the components in it, the risk register, a vulnerabilities list, impact list, etc., and allows you to construct various risk assessments and you get results out of it, including risk scores and risk treatment. Lastly, as a support tool, we have a tool for quickly assessing the maturity of program according to our model, and provide some recommendations for you to go forward. So it's quickly check a box and see what you need to do. It's also covered in the guidance document. I'm going to summarize, and then we're going to answer some of the questions and allow 5 minutes at the end just to review some of the other activities in the CSC. Risk assessments are required. Strive to make them more efficient, effective, and universal. There are many moving parts. Select an industry-based methodology that will work for you and mature into quantitative approaches. Security risk is not highly communicable, but corporate risk assessment risk registers will work with different audiences. And the CISO, as we learned, has to be very important in translating the details of the risk assessment to being able to have it understood and accepted by the board. And that is an active, ongoing process. Complexity may drive stakeholders away. When you design this thing, focus on key threats, assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, and assist stakeholders on providing that. Oftentimes, people put in a lot of threats that, and may not be relevant to their organization. It's hard to do, but state why you excluded them in the assessment. You want to focus on those risk areas that are important in terms of gathering data involving stakeholders. And the outcomes may make risk assessments difficult. So again, bucket these things. And again, as Richard said, maybe bring in some impacts that have happened out in the real world to help drive home the importance of addressing these risks. And we ask that you use the risk assessment security model as a guide to really improve and expand use of risk assessments. And hopefully you'll join the Cybersecurity Collaborative for advice from your peers. Just a couple of minutes. Why don't we look at the chat box here? We have the poll questions up. Q&A. So the first question is, as far as risk assessment analysis goes, what is your opinion about the FAIR approach and using it to get executive leadership to take responsibility for risk? Talked about that a little bit. I think it's a good approach, but again, you're going to probably need some help and assistance to get other people involved. Maybe hire an outside organization that can work with stakeholders and so forth. So I don't know what do the panelists think about that?
It's a lift, and again, part of the issue on it, it's good to quantify in that side, but getting the details sometimes required, that could be problematic, especially in a large organization or where I don't control certain things or have it's another group or another responsibility. It gets to be hard unless you partner very closely with them for them to provide details, because again, it's about, I need to understand this and understand the controls aspect, any compensating controls. It's kind of a layered piece of it. I would say it's like a recipe. It's bread, but it's really complex and there's lots of steps to it. And I think that's the easiest way, is that, hey, yeah, you've got to get practice with it. And the more you do it, the better it is. But going through it the first time, it becomes a really painful process. And what comes out at the end may not be anything close to what you're looking for. And I do recommend seeking help, either from others that have done it or implemented it in your industry before. Crowdsource, find out who's done FAIR in your particular industry. And that is a great thing. Other organizations and that side of it that participate on a regular basis on that is always good as part of that.
Thanks, Richard. Why don't we move to the next one? There are already so many frameworks. True. How can organizations easily tie this framework into their existing practices or tie them into existing control frameworks? And it's important to do that because your concept of residual risk and reducing risk is tied into your control frameworks. Anyone have any thoughts here on how you were able to tie it into NIST or ISO? Any thoughts from the panelists?
I don't know if tie fits. It's kind of especially when you get into compliance controls and things like that, is like
Right.
ISO is a series of standards. Here is what you have to do and follow. It's like it's not how do you want to say it? It's not tie. It is kind of like bound at this point. It's a little stronger because here's a standard that I'm going to be audited against and have to produce the evidence for. So if that is not your speed, you might be one to go to more of the NIST, CSF side of it, which is maturity model, and I can ask questions and work with that. I think start with something. Start with the CIS top 10 functions. There are plenty of control frameworks that's there. Don't try to kill yourself of going, I'm going to the nth end and implement the hardest, most thing, immediately going to FedRAMP before I do anything else along those lines. And anybody that's done compliance, you know where I'm talking about. You'd want to start with easy to work because it's not just you, it's the whole organization. So it's a cultural shift, and you got to take it at a pace that your organization is capable of doing. And I think starting with something small, getting everything done, and you can step up. And the speed that you accelerate is totally up to the business and yourself.
Good point. One thing that we did do in the ISO risk assessment standard and the template we put in, we actually came up with a list of vulnerabilities. I don't have in front of me. Might be weak business processes or poor password processes, and then actually tied them to the ISO controls. So we actually have a vulnerability section, and they actually link to the ISO controls. And then there are many ways to do it. In the spreadsheet, you just kind of put it in, but you can have questionnaires about your control maturity, or how many laptops are encrypted and so forth, and then bring that back into the vulnerability, and then that ties into the risk level. But it is not is it an easy process? No. But again, I would have an intermediary vulnerability list and then tie your framework to those, just from my practical experience. Another question here, let's see how we're doing on time. A few more minutes in time. Is cyber risk communicable when it is the vendor's risk? Well, that's always a challenge. It's the vendor's risk, but we might be assuming it, and that isn't the that's a good question. Isn't the question then how are we addressing the vendor's risk? Are we monitoring it? Are we requiring them to mitigate it? I don't know if anyone else has any comments on that.
I think the only thing I would say to your point is very, very valid is like, what am I doing? I get tagged with it. Again, when breaches happen, regardless of how many parties there, you're all dragged through the mud. So it doesn't matter if I was just a transport mechanism. No, it doesn't matter. You're judged and everything else in the media on what you did, and if you didn't do something and react fast enough. The other thing, you get into this with vendors and especially organizations, the relationship the organization has. This is a 30-year-old company that I have something that you're saying is evil and bad. Is that going to be something that's there? But there's two control points. What happens if I disconnect this vendor from my organization? Do we stop producing things? You got to have those answers. Risk assessment will tell you that, but you need to have those answers, because if something comes up that's bad and you're like, oh, this company is connected to us, has issues, has a ransomware, how do I know that's not trying to come across? I want to disconnect you. And then, we don't know what that's going to do to our business is not the answer you want to give to executives.
Right, exactly. So that's a good point. It's not simply a matter of cutting loose.
And not being able to disconnect can be a risk itself. This is a business critical, too big to fail in my organization. So we have to keep this active at all costs.
What's happened is the availability in the CIA triad is now becoming a bigger A, right, with vendors. So let's move on thank you very much. Risk score means nothing. I couldn't agree with you more. And this is the translation. That's why we suggested putting into buckets and talking about the risks themselves in terms of its impact and also how it's affected other organizations. So good point on that. We have time for more. Consider that the entire RA process is to determine what actions plan should be designed. Is there a point in the RA process where senior cyber leaders just follow their gut feeling for determining required action plans and business stakeholders? And business stakeholders simply must trust them. So when does this really become okay, I know this, I need to do this, it's a gut process? That's a very good point, because I run through these things, and if it isn't understood and felt like a gut process, people question it. But anyone want to comment on that? It sounds like it's a tautological exercise of just coming up with what we already know, perhaps, maybe what they're suggesting here.
I think I'll add in, I don't think there's any time where we as security professionals want to go into executive leaders and just say, trust me. Like
Yeah, exactly.
right. You have to be able to show the value and the benefit of what you've done before, and the outcomes that you expect to get from that decision. And so I don't think there would ever be a time where I would just go, trust me, this is what we need to do. Now, there's reasons behind that, and you should be able to explain those to your executive teams and leaders, so that they begin to understand that, and then they will then get on board with trusting you when you say, this is where we should go, rather than just say, trust me.
Yeah, I again, it's a point of, as a Rosetta, you have to have credibility, you have to listen to them, and this takes time to do. So I think that's excellent. So, well, let me move on. I'm sorry we can't get to the rest of these. We'll try to come back. I just want to share with everyone some of the other things we're doing in the collaborative. We have a security metrics ongoing task force. We're developing we actually got a workbook. We're improving it in terms of operational metrics and so forth. Encourage new members to come in and join at any time with your security challenges. We have some good guidance documents and tools that we're developing. We've started a team on policies. Everyone says, well, policies, everyone has that, but everyone is approaching them differently, and are concerned with policies now related to cloud environments, and now around AI. In fact, in our last meeting, we used ChatGPT to come up with an acceptable use policy, which is very interesting. We're going to be discussing that next week. We have plenty of time. We're just in the beginnings of that. Please come in. We had a boardroom on economic conditions and the impact of security, guidance on for CISOs on retaining staff, the insider threat, work at home issues that are incumbent upon current economic conditions. We'll have a number of other task forces and boardrooms: identity and access management, vulnerability management, OT security, the challenging role of the CISO. And we're considering and looking to have a cyber power hour every other week where any subject can be raised. We'll have some pre-advanced work on that members request, and then have discussions around that, so we can have a continual refreshing of all the security topics domain. So for our members, we have some very, very good things ahead. And for prospective members, we encourage you to come and participate in all the benefits of collaboration. This is just some of our key content that we put in over the last year or so. It's in the presentation. And lastly, I just remind everyone, please take advantage of the CPE credit. Members will get the guidance document workbook over the next few weeks, actually next week. Guests, please make sure you contact us for a copy of this presentation. Connor, hopefully that's the right URL. I'll change that, maybe put it in the chat box if people don't already have that. Please to reach out. We'll send this to you. We've done as much as we could to answer the questions, and thank you for answering your poll questions that we put at the end. I want to thank you all for your time on a Thursday afternoon to hopefully get some new insights and a way to kind of manage the whole risk assessment process, and look forward to improve your process in engaging management and stakeholders and actually making risk acceptance decisions. I'd also like to thank my 4 panelists for their time in developing these materials based upon their experience and many years in a cybersecurity professional. Thank you for spending your time today, offering your expertise. We value, we and all the cybersecurity community value your time in this. It's so greatly appreciated. And again, we look forward to having you hopefully attend some more of these later on. So thanks, everyone. Have a very good afternoon, a great weekend. And thank you so much for your time today.